So I was at the March for Australia the other day, and guess who I saw there? A Greek bloody Adonis? The highlight of the day was seeing a literal sea of Australian flags, and man, it was impressive. I was there because I feel proud and privileged to be an Australian, but more than that, for a number of years I've been talking about how mass immigration is making housing affordability so much worse. One of my main passions is to be able to see more Australians able to afford to own their own home, and mass immigration simply does the opposite. It puts upwards pressure on house prices as well as rents. I've had full-time nurses and teachers reach out to me and say that they've had to live in their cars for periods of time because the housing crisis is so bloody bad. Now, I didn't appreciate seeing most of the marchers being labelled somehow as racist or complicit with neo-Nazis and stuff like that. From what I saw, the great majority were there just to support Australia and to protest against mass immigration, something that the vast majority of Australians don't want and never asked for. Yes, there were racists there, just like there's racists everywhere. I post a photo and so many people carry on saying, what the hell was I there for, because I'm a bloody immigrant? Or, I must support neo-Nazis because some of them turned up. Well, there was heaps more people than I expected, and it got me wondering why there's so much passion around this issue. But I actually think I might know why. It all started when I saw this headline: Australia's mega immigration blowout. New arrivals soar past government promise. How could this bloody happen, I thought? In the year to June, 457,000 permanent and long-term migrants arrived in Australia on a net basis. So that means it's also factoring in departures. Now that figure is 36.5% higher than the Treasury forecast of 335,000, which was presented in the March budget prior to the election. I mean, 36.5% above the forecast is a pretty big freaking miss. As you can see from this chart by Tarek Brooker, these long-term immigration levels are now the highest ever on record. Now you might think, yeah, but everything goes up, so what's the big bloody deal? Well, the big deal is that both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party prior to the election committed to reducing immigration levels. And they most likely made that commitment because the vast majority of Australians actually want lower immigration levels. Why? Because huge migrant inflows has put upward pressure on house prices, which in Australia are now among the most expensive in the entire world. Now, some people think that more people needing housing somehow doesn't impact the housing market, but that's absolutely absurd and goes against economics 101, which is supply and demand. When demand is higher, for example, when more people are competing for fewer houses, that puts upwards pressure on house prices, and it also puts upwards pressure on rents. Now, what's so insidious about these mass immigration levels is that Australia already has some of the lowest rental vacancies in the entire developed world. Since COVID, Australia's rental vacancy rates has been around 1%, and comparing that to a healthy rental vacancy rate, which is considered to be around 3%, you can see how Australian renters are being royally screwed by policies like mass immigration, which is totally out of their control. But from the lows, we started to see some very small improvements, and everyone expected that to continue as the government promised to reduce immigration. However, look what's happened over the past several months. Every major city has seen rental vacancy rates decline again. Now, this gaslighting on immigration and housing really came to a head when Morgan Cox asked a question on the Now Acts Q&A program.
I want to know, is the government going to cut immigration to match housing availability, or are we just going to keep going until every regular working Australian is homeless?
One of the best bloody questions ever asked on Australian TV. And it's completely warranted when you see those devastating rental vacancy rates. The rental market has literally been turned into the Hunger Games. And this has meant there's been a significant rise in working Australians going homeless. Full-time workers such as nurses and teachers have found themselves not being able to secure a rental and having periods where they'd have to sleep in their cars and stuff like that. And this is in Australia, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Let's have a look at the response to Morgan's question.
I'm so sorry you're going through that, and it's a story we all hear right across the country, obviously particularly in the biggest states around the biggest cities. We have been working very hard to get migration levels, immigration levels down to something we think the country can manage.
Working really hard to get them down. They haven't gone down at all. In fact, they've gone bloody up. You know, this way? Now, on top of long-term immigration, temporary visas is also exploding. Here we can see temporary visas on issue exploding to a new all-time high around 2.5 million. And if we translate those temporary visas as a percentage of our total population, it's now surged to nearly 9%. So in the middle of Australia's housing catastrophe, which has now been going on for several years, we're hitting new all-time highs in both long-term and temporary immigration levels. This is an absolute kick in the guts to the millions of Australians who are being negatively impacted. They didn't ask to be locked out of the housing market due to insane prices caused by crazy demand. They didn't ask for rent prices to surge by ridiculous percentages or to have to outcompete hundreds of other applicants just for a rental. There's something very wrong here. Now check out this post from the current Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, which he sent in December 2023. So in the post he stated, "We are fixing Australia's broken migration system." Now this is very telling that back then he classed it as broken. Now the last point in this strategy states they're bringing migration levels back to normal. Now I don't know what's meant by back to normal, but I know that's supposed to mean a reduction, and we've seen the opposite. And since that post was made, it's a year and a half down the road, and Australian house prices have reached new all-time highs in nearly every capital city, meaning millions of Australians are now completely locked out of housing and may never be able to afford their own home. In my opinion, this is breaking the social contract that a country has with its citizens, especially if you work full-time, pay an absolute stack of taxes, but find yourself having absolutely no hope of owning a home. That's a betrayal as far as I'm concerned. So sadly, it doesn't look like immigration demand is going to ease anytime soon. But what about Australia's insane speculative demand for property? Many years ago, the Labor government was fighting hard to try to reduce some of that excessive speculative demand for housing. Here's a clip of Anthony Albanese from 2016.
The real estate industry is this morning saying that they're going to come out really hard against your negative gearing. They're rallying the troops. It's going to be an anti-mining tax style attack. It will be effective and it will be well funded. How are you going to counter it?
Well, we're countering it by the fact that people out there are concerned about housing affordability.
Yes, they are concerned about housing affordability, but that was 2016 when affordability was monumentally better than it is today. Since then, affordability has deteriorated abnormally. The median house price in Sydney is around 1.7 million, and in Brisbane, Adelaide, Melbourne and Perth, the median house price is 1 million or more. So my question is, if housing affordability was a concern back then, today it should be the absolute #1 priority, deserving immediate and critical attention.
How are you going to combat that campaign? It will be effective.
Well, we expect vested interests to go out there and campaign in their own interests. They'll be seen for what it is if they do that. The fact is that our policy out there dealing with the issue of housing affordability is critical, and I find that it's been particularly well received in my electorate, where people in Sydney know that house prices are freezing people out of the market, and that if someone goes to an auction, they don't want to be competing with investors. They actually want to own their own home.
So there was a strong push for housing reform way back then, but today it seems nowhere to be seen. I'm pretty sure deep down everyone knows that Australians are too obsessed with creating wealth via property. When there's a group of property owners making millions and millions, but there's this other section of community completely locked out and unable to afford even a home, it's obvious there's a problem. The fact that you can leverage to the hilt when you buy property and the banks love lending you huge amounts, combined with generous tax incentives such as negative gearing and capital gains tax discount, just ends up creating insane excessive demand for property. This demand must be reduced if we want a healthy housing market that serves all Australians. Now, because this housing crisis has been going for so many years now, I'm seeing more and more news articles talking about tax reform for housing. However, the only recent policies we've seen around housing affordability always seems to be a scheme to try to help first home buyers into the market, but those schemes revolve around giving a grant to first home buyers or reducing the amount of deposit they require. This means they end up with more money than they would have without the assistance, and that extra money also creates more demand, which pushes up house prices even further. So the current help for housing affordability is simply screwing up the housing market further. I'm telling ya, the gaslighting on housing is off the freaking charts. But if there was a real, actual desire to improve housing affordability, I think we'd have a chance.
Minister, if house prices don't come down, doesn't that mean that this system is stacked against young people, that it's just not going to work for them?
Sure, and Dave, we may have a difference of view about this. I have a strong view. Our government's policies are not going to reduce house prices. We want house prices to grow sustainably.
Crap me. I'm Bika Konstantinos.